All statements and opinions expressed by guests of the Adult in the Room podcast are strictly their own and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of the host, producers, or advertisers. All interviews are presented in their most complete possible form in the interests of free speech. No statements should be interpreted as financial, legal, or medical advice. Listener and viewer discretion are strongly advised.
It's the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. That's me.
Leslie Corbly is my guest, and she's an author, a lawyer, and she is just recently released her book, Progressive Prejudice. And thank you so much for coming on the Adult in the Room podcast. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for spending some time. Tell me a little bit about how this James Comey thing and, big payback by the Trump administration and all that play into your major thesis, which is that there's a lot of prejudice on the part of progressives, but there's a real line of real hatred there as well. So take it away if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Well, I think it's an example in the political realm of what's occurring culturally, which is that there's not a lot of scrutiny put on the actions of those on the left. I think that individuals such as James Comey probably likely didn't really expect any of this to be their behavior to be scrutinized, maybe in the way they're comfortable scrutinizing others' behavior. And I think what we're moving into, both culturally, politically, and socially, is a time period where obviously we're a lot more tribal than we used to be, and I think that's going to continue to carry on the way it has been. And we're increasingly, I think the public is increasingly becoming aware of the fact that the way government actually operates in practice is not really the way it's been presented to the public as operating, right? We have a much different system of government than what the public has previously been aware of. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see where these investigations land, but the structure of the government itself, I don't think is going to be subject to change anytime soon, meaning we're going to continue to see these type of investigations from one party against the other back and forth.
For a while, I imagine so, because heretofore the Republicans never did anything about that. They just said, well, we're people, or Marquez, the Queensbury rules, whatever. And, according to Hoyle, we can't do that. Nevertheless, they always had the ability to bring the law to bear in cases where they'd been wronged.
Well, and I think a lot of that had to do with the gatekeeping of narratives and of cultural power within media. So I think a lot of the reason that Republicans were perceived as being maybe lapdogs for a very long time was that in order to attack, you have to have to some degree buy-in with the public. You have to get your narratives and your framing to the public. And that's, I think, what Donald Trump in some ways broke the left's stronghold on cultural narratives and on being able to frame issues in a way that always placed their opponents at a disadvantage. And that's what the left has been used to. They've been used to being sort of perceived as having moral authority, regardless of whether or not that moral authority was something they should have been receiving. And now that's falling apart. And that largely does have to do with the rise of Donald Trump. And, one can love
Agreed.
Him, has little to do with that, but the left's sort of monopoly on framing narratives has sort of fallen apart.
The other thing I believe is going on is that there is, in addition to losing the narrative, they've always been given the benefit of the doubt because, of course, they were the peaceful people. They were the people who just meant the best for everyone, and they never undertook a cause unless they wanted to do well for the people. And now it's being outed primarily that generally they do things to feather their own nests, is what it's coming down to. We've seen that with respect to the stuff that has happened with the Elon Musk Doge program, and we've found all these NGOs that were they were there to collect money, give it to their favorite projects, and then kick back money to the Democrats. I mean, it's just rinse and repeat over and over.
Yes, and that's you're absolutely correct in regarding what we're just seeing a lot of trend shifts. And again, it's fascinating because Donald Trump isn't a particularly conservative person. So, people talk about the rise of the alt-right or the rise of conservatism. And I actually think that's more of a threat, but that's a threat generations down the line, right? To the extent that we're going to swing pendulum swing way too far right is a future threat. Right now, I mean, you look at what's considered right wing and it's not even in like political theory terms, remotely conservative.
Right.
Donald Trump is like he's a Manhattan, essentially a Democrat from back in the day. So this idea that, we're pendulum swinging right, it's more like we're pendulum swinging away from the left. The left having sort of this absolute monopoly on defining the terms of debate, defining what is and isn't moral, and sort of having that gatekeeping power. And I think that that's causing a lot of flailing right now because they're losing, again, control of the narrative. And that's what they've had for the past, 50 plus years. I mean, all through the 20th century was an insurgence of left-wing thought, and that's crumbling before them because their system of ideas is being challenged. And I think those on the left are not familiar or comfortable with having their ideas scrutinized because they're not used to having to self-reflect and go, oh, maybe my idea here could cause harm to someone. They don't have to think about their own types of prejudice. They're only used to critiquing other forms of prejudice, right? Yeah. Oh, I see that this is I see the individuals who may fall on the margin of religious or conservative ideologies, for example, but they don't really see the individuals who fall on the margin of their preferred systems of thought because they don't really have a capacity, I don't think, collectively to self-reflect in that way yet and go, wow, there's some who could fall on that,
In a recent American Greatness article you wrote, you used this meme that was put forward by somebody else. I don't recall his name, but it was just the way.
Right. Yeah.
So tell me about this because this pretty much tells the story, and explain it.
So I think it kind of succinctly demonstrates how the left has sort of operated over the past, like decades, which is where the center has not really changed, but those on the left have gone further and further left such that they see the center as really far right. And so they start to demonize and vilify anyone who thinks differently. So an increasing amount of like purity of thought is focused on, right? If you disagree at all about trans ideology, you're a bigot. If you dissent at all regarding immigration, you're a xenophobe. If you have different opinions about, say, sexual ethics or things of that nature, you're a homophobe, right? These things that are completely detached really from reality. And the average person can kind of understand you can have different viewpoints, and that doesn't mean you hate someone, but those on the left have really dug their heels into the sand that if you think differently, it's because you're fueled by hatred. And it's fascinating because they can't see how that itself fuels hatred, which is what's happening. This is on display with the public in these very, very public attempts at assassination, attempting to assassinate Donald Trump, and then in fact assassinating Charlie Kirk, which is that, again, this idea that I'm fighting hatred in this way, right? That there's these people who hate everyone and we have to sort of stop them at all costs. And it's a really damaging way to look at the world. And I think that increasingly the public is seeing it for what it is and saying you preach love, but you practice hate. And it's funny because it's kind of an inversion of what you heard a lot about Christianity on those on the right. Think of in the early 2000s when there was the campaign going on for gay marriage. It was really easy, I think, to vilify certain conservatives who would talk about God's love, and then they would maybe engage with those who were homosexual or who thought differently in a really kind of unhelpful way. Let's put it that way. Like they could be very belligerent or distasteful in the way they communicated, and it made it really easy for those on the left to latch on and say, like, you practice, you're talking about God as a God of love, but you practice hate. And I think they're running into that same problem themselves now, and they don't know how to contend with it, which is that they're talking about tolerance, love, compassion, grace, but they have none of that to extend to anyone who goes in their view, too far right, which is an increasingly, it could be, like the guy who made that meme, I think, is like an atheist evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
Like, these are people who are not remotely right wing. I mean, and Donald Trump's been able to get them into his fold because of this dynamic where the left shoots so far left and they have blinders on. They can't see, how someone outside of the ideology is going to interpret their words or actions. And so, to no shock, those who are more moderate just go the other direction. They go to where they feel welcome, which is on the right.
So you say it's basically a religion. Right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think in my belief, and people can disagree, I guess, with this premise, but I think at a certain point, any belief system becomes religious. You have to act it out. You're going to have certain taboos. You're going to have, gatekeeping of some kind of what ideas are acceptable and aren't acceptable, what things you can and can't enact, both culturally and individually. So I just don't really think that there's some clear-cut delineation between any belief system and religion. The reality is, at scale in a society, you're going to have belief system that's being followed, and at some point that will look very religious. You're going to have sacred ideas, things we aren't supposed to attack, ideas we're supposed to all sort of venerate in some way because that's how we collectively engage as humans. So that's just as a premise level, I think to some degree it all collapses. But absolutely on the progressive side, I think there's a very zealous religious-like zeal here that becomes very impractical. It's very reminiscent of fundamentalist religious mindsets where it's not just that you believe the system, like one would believe religion. It's that they struggle to have any concept of how someone could not believe in the system, right?
Sadducees and the Pharisees then.
Yes, very pharisaical in that way. And this inability to it's closed-minded in the sense they struggle to enter into someone else's mindset without pathologizing it. So, for example, I understand how someone thinks this way, but it's because they're hateful, right? So I'm studying hate by understanding them rather than actually, having true empathy, which is being able to understand someone's mindset, the way they have experienced the world, maybe how their experiences of the world have shaped their ideological viewpoints. I think there's a lot of, again, I think that they really struggle with that on the left right now because they haven't had a lot of friction intellectually in a very long time because the universities have been thoroughly left-wing.
Well, that brings up a observation I was going to bring up. I mean, I'm not sure that we've ever experienced a time in which the left, in this case, has been able to overtake all the institutions, indoctrinate all the school children, write and have all of their messages be amplified by selected media, most media, all at the same time. And at the same time, having the rabble on the street like Antifa and the other people, Hamas supporters and all sorts of things, literally bringing pain to those who disagree. Yes. It's very mindful to me of the 1789, the French Revolution, where you had, the Jacobins and then you talked about the purity tests and all sorts of things. Talk a little bit about that and what you see in this current time right now.
Well, absolutely, a lot of purity tests, a lot of social capital that you stand to lose, especially if you're in an elite or more intellectual, maybe the best way to say it is non-blue collar. I don't think some of these problems exist as much in the blue collar kind of ordinary spaces in American society. I think it tends to come from education. And the reason for that is that education right now is so replete with leftist ideas. In order to get through the educational system, you are just inundated with left-wing thought, which was a fascinating transition for me because I grew up homeschooled where, in a time period where homeschooling was not popular. And so part of the book is also autobiographical. So it kind of walks through my belief formation process in the backdrop of, talking about progressive ideologies. So I was never impressed by progressive ideologies. I thought they were incredibly hypocritical and had a lot of deficiencies. But when you enter into the collegiate system, which my parents were very intent on their children going to college, you are in it. It's a very jarring transition for a lot of reasons. But intellectually, one of the most jarring things about it is how clearly you can see that so many of your peers have been inculcated in a left-wing echo chamber without even an awareness of it. The things that they've normalized are all one direction. So even finding other alternate viewpoints, you have to almost have had access to a different type of life to even be aware.
A different library in your brain.
Library. They're not even aware that these voices exist. They're not aware of dissenting voices that existed throughout history because they've been edited out. And so and because education in America is so standardized, they aren't used to running into peer groups with different types of literary knowledge. Does it make sense? So whereas one of the benefits actually I thought of being homeschooled was that you kind of had I had an awareness that the way my parents operated was different than others. So it kind of makes you a little curious, at least made me more curious of, okay, well, what do other people think? I'm aware that they're reading from a different library, so to speak, than I am. And that makes me kind of curious about their ideas. Well, a lot of these kids that had come from public school, it was like they didn't have that awareness because every single person they knew was in the same literary landscape, so to speak, the same ideas landscape. So it was fascinating because to me, it really reminded me of some of the more extreme versions of this that can happen in church settings where someone has no awareness that like people's ideas about God are different because they've only ever been in their little Baptist church, right? It's kind of the same thing in the public school. They don't even know that other aspects of thought exist because they've never been exposed to them in any meaningful way. And so I thought it was incredibly narrow-minded. and really dangerous. That was my opinion as well, was that
Yeah.
it was very dangerous because it didn't encourage students and those who are frankly going to lead society in the future to have the intellectual humility and an awareness that different schools of intellectual thought even exist. You know, things like mainline economics, for example,
Yes.
Thomas Sowell or something. I mean, it's just edited out. You only are exposed to the Chicago school of thought. I mean, the same thing kind of with political theory. You end up in these.
Well, that used to be a decent school of thought, the Chicago School of Thought. Yeah, but then,
Yeah, but you don't even know that Austrian exists. It's not there. It's not
All right.
I
know.
Seek it out. And that's what I mean by it puts all these barriers to entry intellectually to being frankly intellectually open-minded. So they think they're being open-minded, and that's part of the problem. And they're self-identifying that way, but they're not in fact practicing it, because to be open-minded, you
actually have to talk to other people you don't agree with.
Aware of what other
and you have to
think in a non-judgmental manner.
Oh, well, I was going to say, you try not to kill them. You know, I've had people leave conversations with me, family members, and then I'm sorry, I just can't live in your world.
The worst, like you're assuming you know more about them based just on their viewpoint than you do. That's what I mean by it. It divorces the experience.
Yes.
Like what experience? Are you familiar with their life patterns? Are you familiar with why they came to that conclusion? You know, so for take an example of this, I think it's really easy to visualize, is how we have a lot of sympathy and culture for women who've had a string of really negative relationships with men. And we're not shocked that they have really, maybe overly generalize how bad men are, right? We kind of give a lot of grace to them because we go, well, she probably had a really string of bad relationships, like lay off, right? We don't actually have the same level of sympathy for a man who speaks negatively about a woman, right? It's sort of like, that's considered misogyny, regardless of whether it actually comes from a misogynistic motive, right? Just like a woman who speaks really negative about men might not really hate men. She may have just had a string of terrible relationships, but we don't really think the same way in terms of a man speaking poorly of women, even though it could be true, right? So that's what I mean by there's not a lot of curiosity and true equality shown on the left to the fact that everyone has these negative experiences with different groups, right? African Americans are allowed to talk about white people in a way white people can't, right? So they have all these rigid, and again, cuts against being open-minded, these rigid ideas of oppressor and oppressed, and how people are supposed to sort of take on, frankly, these social roles. I mean, that's what a lot of the issues with race and gender come down to. You're supposed to take on this social role of being a white oppressor in some way. And that might be true in some cases. I mean, obviously there were issues with slavery in our past. I don't think you have to whitewash that.
Yeah, no.
Pretending as if that's all of reality, you know, is where I think that they really lose track with the average person, because the reality is we're nowhere close to where we were in 1950. And so there's this aspect of not being able to acknowledge change in culture that goes on the left, which is counterintuitive, right? Because they talk about how culture is always shifting, but they act, frankly, as if certain gendered and racial dynamics have not ever changed since, say, 1960. And that's not reality.
That bleeds into the politics of the matter, and I just wanted you to riff a little bit on James Comey, our friend. Robert Mueller, you don't have to talk about Robert Mueller, but I'm just telling people who's in the picture, and there's Barack Obama. Now, these guys all got together, and they decided, as well with other intelligence officials and law enforcement officials, and even MI6 got involved. And I think the Australian spy agency got involved as well. And they all worked against Donald Trump. And they all knew, all of them, knew that the information they had was fake. And they all knew it came from Hillary Clinton. And yet, because they felt they could, because the left gave them permission, felt like they could oust a sitting president of the United States. Now, tell me, you and your theories in your book, how that works in the real world in this case.
I think it's honestly not surprising to me really at all, because the structure of being able to surveil and inappropriately monitor Americans has been ongoing since the Patriot Act in the early 2000s. So these weren't like new systems that were developed during the Obama administration. So it's not surprising to me that those in power may think, oh, we can kind of weaponize and utilize these systems in a way that is to our advantage. We're going to manipulate the system to obtain the outcome we want. And frankly, there hasn't been broad public awareness of how these systems operate in reality. And what I mean by that is, you can look at the laws and whatnot, and there's a lot of ability for those in government, and you saw it all the time in the Biden administration, to sort of have plausible deniability, right? They use corporate speak in their public addresses, to the public is all corporate speak and deny, right? And without the evidence, because you can't investigate it, how are you going to ever have this come to light? So it does shock me at all that those in power may go, oh, wow, these systems are easy to use. The public may or may not be aware of this. It's going to be very easy for us to kind of, manipulate this outcome we want, that we think is favorable to us and our cause. And so that's what I mean by Donald Trump's his rise to power. And again, this has nothing to do, in my opinion, with whether you like him or not, or whether you think he's the best candidate or the best president. It's sort of irrelevant. So I take a macro view of looking at how is this actually functioning, right? Which is that his presidency and his rise into political power shattered sort of the narrative of those on the left, and it shattered their ability to control that narrative. And that's why they're flailing in the wake of his rise to power. It's not because he's some, Hitler or whatnot, which is very odd to me because we don't live in 1930s Germany. I have no idea why we're using these analogies as if every historical event looks exactly the same. We're in a totally different era. But I think he shattered their ability to maintain that narrative. And he really, to his credit, I mean, whether you like him or not, to his credit, he really didn't give up, and he went all in on his cause. And in a lot of ways, he won. He played the game and he won. And now he's the one with the investigative power, and he's the one who can wield that against his opponents. And so I think that's the era we're in. Does that make sense? As sort of structurally, these issues aren't going to go away anytime soon. But I don't think that the likes of, again, when this happened, when Russiagate happened, recall what the environment was. There had never been any accountability for surveillance. The public was largely unaware of how these systems operated, which is why they could concoct this whole, Russiagate narrative and have it be believable to the public. I think that so much has come to light in the past decade that we're on the same landscape for what the public will believe anymore. All the conspiracy theories are true.
Right.
That's what people are increasingly seeing. And so I don't think that we can really put the genie back in the bottle. I don't think whether you're on the right or the left, we're going to move back into an era where people have this trust and where conspiracy theories are seen as like irrational, right? I just think we're going to move into that space because there's been too much distrust that's been broadly on display in the public. And
that requires more of us to be better at discerning between candidates, because I think if nothing else, the large money operations, bundlers and all that stuff, dark money they call it, and the fact that both sides embrace it as a result of Citizens United, that teaches us, that's showing us the way, right? I mean, that's the way it's going to be.
And that's what I mean by it's structural. It has nothing. I mean, I don't like the structure particularly. I don't think it's healthy from a republic, like the standpoint of a healthy republic. But the structure is what it is, and it was exposed. Again, it's not those on the left are inherently worse than those on the right, but the reality is it was exposed in a way that really damaged the credibility of those on the left. I think that's why their movement, the Democratic Party, is flailing and struggling, because their entire image to the public has been shattered. And it's easy for them to call the Republicans or Donald Trump or whoever hypocrites, but it's like the pot talking to the kettle. There's no compelling narrative there. And those on the right have been clearly disenfranchised structurally for a much longer time than those on the left. And everyone kind of intuitively knows that. Who was going to get more? Were you going to be blackballed in Hollywood if you came out as pro-choice? No, that's what you were expected to be.
Right.
You're going to be
exactly
for voting for Kamala Harris? Absolutely not. That's what you're expected to be in Hollywood, in elite institutions. And so because they are the establishment, they stand more to lose when the power structure is questioned, right? And that's just the reality. Now, it might not be like that in 20 to 50 years, but it is right now. And they're struggling, I think, to gain their bearings because, like I said, they're not used to having to answer as to their own flaws. They're used to being able to critique and have their position be deemed to be morally superior, right? Like, you're trying to be moral. So it's sort of like the deference, again, that you would give almost to like a pastor in a church. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. Like they're used to being on a pedestal in a way where they're assumed to be behaving in a moral manner, irregardless of their actual conduct or their intent or really any other evidence to the contrary. That was just assumed, and it no longer is. And that's obviously a tough place to be psychologically.
Thank you so much for coming on. Leslie Corbly is her name, Progressive Prejudice. And, you're not allowed to say that progressives are prejudiced or bigoted, but I do all the time. I say they're bigoted because they are. I mean, when they look at me and they say, well, I can't talk to you. I mean, there are people who do that. And I've put up with it for decades now. I've been in the game a long, long time as a conservative and been there, done that. And I literally got the T-shirt and started making it myself.
I love it.
Leslie, thanks so much. I appreciate everything you do. And I will read your book. It's going to be fantastic. I'm very excited about it, actually. Take care. Thank you. That's awesome.